Good afternoon, everybody. You have made it to the last session of the day. Well done, you. Exhausted, mentally fatigued, and here for compliance learning. Okay, so you're the crazy people. No. It is interesting, isn't it, when we talk about compliance, that most of our employees would go, oh, click next, quiz at the end, e-learning, want to die. That's not how it needs to be, of course, because the risk for compliance, it needs to be the e-learning or the learning or the digital assets, the videos, whatever it is, it needs to be the one that all of your employees know is the most important learning that they're going to do that year, in truth. Because when you think of the risks and the reason why we have compliance learning in the first place, the risks are inherent and everybody needs to understand what they are and how to buy into them so that they keep you and them and your organization safe. So it is good that you are here at the end of a very long day, at the end of a very special day, given that we're back to learning technologies, to hear our two speakers today tell you stories that remind us that compliance learning does not need to be click next, quiz at the end, everyone wants to die, but actually is engaging and impactful and really an important part of every year's worth of learning calendar. My name is Michelle Parry-Slater and I'm really pleased to be your chair today. So a couple of little things. We are going to take questions at the end. We're going to have one presentation, then the other, and questions at the end. But I know that if you have a burning question, sitting on that means you've stopped listening. So if you really do have a question to ask, do feel free to raise your hand and interrupt the speakers. But if you are okay to keep your questions to the end, we'll do 20 minutes, and another 20 minutes of Q&A. Is that all right? Is that a good deal? But please don't feel I can't hear because I have to ask my question. All right. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our amazing speakers. We first up have Fraser, and Fraser Simpson from Wellcome Trust. He is a qualified lawyer, but really gets it when it comes to L&D. So who better to have us talking to us about compliance? And we'll then be followed by the most wonderful Josh Worrell. Josh is with Les Mills. I've been with French people today. Les Mills, fitness organisation. And he will actually be telling the story of his previous organisation, another well-known fitness organisation. But I'll give them the opportunity to tell you as much as they need to about their organisations. But I'd like you to introduce our speakers to the stage as Fraser begins today. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks for having me here today to talk about compliance and behaviour change, and learning really as a key ingredient in that recipe. My name's Fraser. I work for the Wellcome Trust. I hope some of you have heard of the Wellcome Trust. If you haven't, we're a huge charity based in the UK, and our focus is funding science research, and we do that to the tune of about £1 billion per year, and we really try to shape policy and debate globally around global public health. I wanted to acknowledge that I'm feeling slightly like an innocent abroad here at the Excel today. I'm not an L&D professional. I'm not a techie person at all, like so many of you will be. As Michelle said, I'm a lawyer by background. Please don't hold that against me. I try not to identify too closely as one. But I think what we all probably share in the room is an understanding around the value of human communication in learning and encouraging human beings to behave in certain ways. And at Wellcome, we've started out on a very deliberate journey around ethics and compliance and how we try to catalyse the right behaviours in moments that matter. And we're very much still on that journey. Because it's a constantly evolving landscape. I think it's sort of rather like art. You never quite know when the painting's finished. We're always going to be on a journey. But I wanted to share with you some of the thinking that we've had, and not because we consider we've got it right, far from it, it's a learning journey, but because we're a learning organisation, we're humble, and we want to share and learn with others and from others. Now, let me try with the clicker and see if I can get this right. There we go. So at its core, Wellcome's a grant-making charity. We don't make things, we don't sell things, we don't have shareholders, we don't have customers. What we do is to generate impact for the benefit of society by influencing, convening and funding people to do useful scientific research. So we fund people to find, let's take a topical example, vaccines, mental health treatments, really, really useful stuff. And we've made a very conscious choice. And that choice is that it's vital for us not to just focus on only what we do, but also on how we do it. And I think that's why we've decided we have to behave in an ethical and compliant way. And because organisations act through people and not through policies, we know that we've got to catalyse the right behaviours from our staff in those moments that matter. So what do we mean when we talk about compliance? Michelle really sort of covered this. It's one of those words that brings on different reactions in different people, isn't it? How are you all feeling about it? I mean, obviously enthused, excited, gripped to be here to talk about compliance. No, so often, you know, the reaction you get is, oh God, switched off, bored, not another policy. What we need to do is change that. None of those are uncommon feelings, but we've got to shift that. Getting someone to stop and think before they act might not sound like it's too much to ask. But when you're confronted with behaviour change through just a set of policies, that's a tough sell. Code of conduct, you know, a fraud policy, that all sounds about as exciting as doing the ironing. People assume it's going to be restrictive, it's going to be dry, it's going to be patronising, and especially so when there's other important, meaningful stuff that you could be doing. I get, you know, I'm a lawyer, I get there are reasons why you want to evidence compliance being done. There's real legal value in being able to demonstrate that boxes have been ticked. But, you know, is that really the reason why compliance is important? I don't think so. I think compliance is really about improving how organisations operate. It's making us better organisations, and that doesn't come from ticking boxes. That comes from influencing mindset. It comes from catalysing the right behaviours in moments that matter. And it's about understanding that our own individual actions, you know, those of all of our individual staff, when taken collectively, drive our organisational impact, or in a worst case scenario, actually undermine our organisational impact. So that's why I think compliance is important for us at Wellcome, and I think the same probably holds true for all organisations. But on this slide, I wanted to give two sort of key take-home messages from me for this session. Well, the first one, I would say this, wouldn't I? Invest in ethics and compliance before something goes wrong. If you think it's expensive or it's a lot of effort to do that, well, wait until something major does go wrong, then see how you feel. Really see how much you'd have preferred peace of mind. The second message then is, you know, once you've chosen to do that, think about it from a human perspective. And remember, what we're trying to do is to influence those human mindsets and human behaviours. Who does compliance well? Does your organisation do compliance well? Have you got policies you're asked to sign? Probably. Have you got training and staff inductions? Probably. All positive things. I think most organisations in the room would identify with that. There's a saying I came across, and I'm probably misquoting it, but forgive me if I am, but I came across it a few years back, and it said, when finding out who does compliance well, look for those organisations that have been fined at least $100 million in the last year. Because at that level of fine, that's probably focused their minds. But if it was longer than a year ago, they've probably forgotten about it already. I think there's probably a fair bit of truth in that. But I think there's also an awful lot we can learn from forward-thinking organisations and also from some more heavily regulated sectors that tend to be ahead of the curve in their thinking. But what's certainly true is it can be really quite challenging to persuade an organisation to invest in ethics and compliance in the absence of a burning platform. It's a bit like being enthused about buying an insurance policy. Nobody really wants to do it. But I think it's really important that we do. And that's what we've been doing at Welcome, trying to be the best we can be, supporting our staff in their own decision-making, helping them trust their judgment, supporting a risk-aware culture underpinning delivery of our strategy and mission. And then crucially at the same time, mitigating risk and giving us all peace of mind. How do we think about ethics and compliance at Welcome? I've tried to distill this into a simple diagram, what I call our virtuous circle. And that really sets out at the highest level our methodology for compliance programs. I hate the terminology of compliance programs precisely because it switches people off. So I prefer behavior change programs. And this methodology we apply in relation to any real compliance activity, whether we're talking about data protection, fraud and bribery, or safeguarding, whatever that happens to be. So, sort of by way of overview, first of all, we start with a diagnosis and risk assessment, so we can fully understand that issue across our organisation. Likelihood, impact, potential risk hotspots, where we might need to target specific compliance interventions. We then make sure we've got in place the right policy environment and policy landscape. We're doing a lot of work around improving those policies to make sure that they're as helpful and as useful and user-friendly as they can possibly be. We invest in making them useful and accessible then by developing helpful tools and articulating clear controls. And some of those are tech-based, and some of those are much more simple. But all of them are user experience focused. We also are investing heavily in learning and training as a key tool. And for us, there are a couple of really key elements to that. One's the purely practical piece around explaining to our staff what to do and when and how to use a tool. And that's fine. But the hugely important piece that I think is so often missed is influencing mindsets by explaining to people why something is important to our organisation, why it should be important to them as an individual, and why they should be thinking about it and acting on it. And building out of that, we then try to spark conversations and engagement across the organisation, trying to keep a topic live. We completely open that most of the compliance topics we're talking about are those sorts of things that people categorise as dull but important. What we want to do is try to unpack that. We want to make it live, interesting, not just a once per year thing, not just a poster on the wall of the coffee room. And there are a couple of ways we've done that, and one is through our The Only Way is Ethics episodes, and I'll mention a bit about that later on. The virtuous cycle on that last slide I described really talks to the formal stuff that's needed, but I think that misses a huge part of the whole story. And we're really talking about cultural change. And to drive cultural change, I think the formal processes are all necessary, but in themselves insufficient. It's like the ingredients in a cake. You know, on their own, they're hopeless, but put together, they come together in something that's tasty. But what we need is that less formal stuff to engage, embed, and shift mindsets. And by informal stuff, I'm talking about the tone from the top, the influence, the demonstrated leadership that's visible, that's audible, the authentic language that's inclusive and relevant and actually resonates with your people. Storytelling is really important, role modelling, and stories around people role modelling. You know, perhaps the use of imagery, sound, humour, I think is all really important. And that's really what I mean about talking to the human. Making it clear, making it relevant, making it authentic, and really crucially, making it easy to do, because this is all about influencing human beings. I think of it as a mindset and behaviour change journey. And we've got drivers wanting to get people to do things. And through communications and through learning and persuasion, we can influence mindsets. We can shift people into a mindset of, okay, I get it. I care sufficiently about this to actually want to do something. And with that level of engagement, we can then leverage other interventions to really more effectively drive the behaviours we want to see to generate the right outcomes for the organisation. One of those two key messages I set out at the start of the session was talk to the human. And I thought it would be, I hope it would be interesting to talk through some examples of how we've gone about approaching that at Wellcome. And again, this isn't us saying we've done this brilliantly. This is just us wanting to share and very open to learning from others as well. But what we've found is that so often compliance is really too legal. And perhaps as a lawyer I can get away with saying this, but I'd probably be shot by many of my legal colleagues. But actually, being over legal is just really off-putting to most human beings. And too many compliance policies and training modules are written by lawyers for lawyers. And they use language and terminology that they care about, but the rest of us just don't. And then we're really surprised that people don't engage. You know, you wouldn't teach somebody to drive by explaining engineering. You wouldn't teach parenting by explaining genetics. Don't be legal. You know, no one cares what Section 37(1) of the Act says. We want to know why something's important. We want to know what we need to do and when. What else have we done at Wellcome? We're rewriting our policies. We found we had, like most organisations, an awful lot of them that were quite long and mainly gathering virtual dust in the virtual filing cabinet. What we're trying to do is to rewrite those to be short, focused, accessible, useful. And for example, just one of the simple things we've tried to do is to add a highlighted box at the top of each of our staff policies, summarising the key points. It's basically, if you read one thing, because let's face it, you're only going to read one thing because it's a boring policy. If you read one thing, read this. And we articulate half a dozen bullet points. And I think that's really helpful. We get a lot of good feedback about that. In our compliance digital learning, we've been developing a suite of that, as well as our code of conduct and the campaign we launched around it internally. We've really tried to use authentic and straightforward language. And again, we get a lot of really good feedback here around getting away from jargon. We try and make it real. We try to make it really relevant to our staff, who they are, and crucially, what they actually do, so that it's not generic about, you know, Acme Inc., people that sit behind desks. This is actually relevant to our staff. People can identify with it. And I think that's really helpful. It helps bring it to life. We also try to use analogies where we can, because a lot of this stuff's quite dry. So if we can really make people understand it through analogizing, so much the better. We've thought hard about user experience, and we always design with inclusion in mind. And that was one of the key drivers behind building a whole suite of digital learning modules. It became really valuable through the lockdown periods where, of course, everybody was at home. But actually giving people the ability to do learning at their speed, at their time, is really helpful. They don't suddenly have to turn up that one Monday at 11 o'clock every year to do it. We've also thought a lot about how people learn, the use of repetition, simple visuals. I've got two young children, a 5-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I dread to think how many hours I've sat through number blocks and alpha blocks on CBeebies. But it's really eye-opening to suddenly go, oh, I see what those programs are trying to do around getting human beings to learn with those simple learning techniques. And how can we bring those through in our own learning? We've also considered a lot about the environments our staff are working in. And again, I think sometimes it's really tempting to be self-centered and just assume everybody in your organization has the same work experience that you do. Fortunately, not everybody sits behind a computer screen at Wellcome like I do. Actually, a significant proportion of our staff are visitor experience staff in our public museum and library, the Wellcome Collection. They're not sat behind a desk with a computer with access to the intranet. So the creation of online training modules through our Workday LMS actually isn't so effective for them. So we've had to come up with some interesting takes on how we can make things more accessible and more relevant, and developing things, for example, like a new safeguarding app that sits on mobile devices, because actually everybody walking the floor of the museum has a mobile device. We've also not been afraid of getting user feedback. Welcome's the sort of organisation where a lot of smart people that have a lot of opinions, and it's always unwise to do things without getting feedback from everybody. And therefore we haven't shied away from doing that, and used it really to help shape what we do. And I think one of the key learnings I had there was around really making the effort to understand how users are feeling, and then to explicitly acknowledge and empathise with that. And that feels like a really human way to connect and to engage with people. And then finally, my last slide, I wanted to talk about being braver. What do I mean by being braver? And I think that probably means don't be afraid of trying things that might be different. And I'm not talking about going crazy. Don't do a flash mob or whatever it happens to be. You need to have a feel for where your organisation is, an understanding of that culture, and be responsive to that. And if I'm totally honest, I would have liked us at Wellcome to be braver in our approach than we were. But we reasoned that actually a lot of this was new for us, and we were taking those first steps. And we feel like we were slightly brave, and maybe next time we could be braver. But what did we do that felt brave? Well, for us, supported by Actium, we made a campaign launch for all staff called Trust Your Judgment. It was the first time we'd ever done anything like this, really trying to reinforce core messages, centred around a launch video, poster campaign, and lots of other component parts. Big internal communications push. And we used sort of clever language, gentle humour, some quite strong visual imagery. You're really trying to create an internal brand around compliance. And then other marketing hooks like the sort of repetition of key phrases and concepts. And it's been interesting over the last 2 years since we launched that campaign to hear a number of those audible and hooks become part of the normal vocabulary. It entertains me, and I'm a geek, so I'm standing in the lunch queue behind people buying sandwiches. But it's interesting when you just overhear some of those little hooks that you've sown become part of normal language, and you go, okay, yeah, this is getting traction. Core to that campaign launch was using tone from the top, strong messaging from our director, from the chair of our board. Don't tell them this, but I think much more importantly, we included a really broad array of voices of genuine influencers across the organisation. Those people who are actually trusted colleagues. Listening to the boss carries weight, but listening to your peers carries that authentic message. There's actually Agnes, who's been there for 35 years doing the petty cash. People trust her. That really carries weight when she says this is important in a way that the boss saying it doesn't. We've also built this series of lunchtime talks I mentioned earlier. We call them episodes of TOWIE, The Only Way is Ethics. And we host those as quarterly hour-long episodes. And the idea is to get really interesting external speakers to come in and talk to all of our staff. Still all voluntary, but we get really quite impressive turnout. They come and talk to us for an hour on a key compliance topic. And we start at the biggest ticket level. Why on earth is this important, full stop? And then we gradually sort of bring that down. And we say, well, why is that important to Wellcome? Why is that important to our organisational mission? Why does this matter? How does it help us pursuing the improvement of public health? And we talk about Wellcome's role in that particular ecosystem, and then bring it to a personal level. What can each of us then do individually, knowing that individually our actions collectively drive our impact? And it's really trying to spark those conversations in a natural human way across the organisation, I think that really hooks people in and makes people think about them. And a couple of examples. So our most recent episode was, a month ago, and we did a session on fraud and corruption, where Transparency International came in and talked to us. The one prior to that on modern slavery, with Unseen coming to speak to us. And prior to that, we had a panel session on the value of speaking up, with a panel including the NHS National Guardian and the chair for the Institute for Business Ethics. And we found that it's really quite captivating, and we've got really impressive numbers of people coming to listen because it suddenly becomes something they care about. It gives us the opportunity to reinforce the messages we want to reinforce. And it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, really. It's a bit silly, but it's brave, or at least we think it's brave because we've never done it before. It's probably not brave for other people. It's a bit different. It's imagination-grabbing, and it's human, and it helps us to spark those conversations, influence mindsets, and ultimately drive those behaviours in moments that matter. And that's it from me.
Awesome, thanks, Fraser. So I want to talk to you a little bit about my journey with a previous employer and that compliance pathway, what that looked like, and what we learned through that process, and hopefully give you some takeaways from my experience that you can put into action when it comes to doing it yourself. And my background is in the health and fitness industry. I currently work for Les Mills. You may know the body pump people. Previously, I was the UK's largest health and fitness operator. So I've spent a long time, part of my career, my background was as a personal trainer, selling stuff that people don't want, but they need. And I found myself doing the same thing in the compliance world, right? And one of the analogies I often use, does anybody like doing the washing up? Put your hands up. Who likes doing the washing up? There's always a couple of weird people in the room. You can put your hands down. Now we know who you are. You can keep your hands down. But if I said to you, look, I want you to do 40 to 60 minutes of moderate to high intensity washing up, how excited do you get? Yeah, not very, right? And that's the same thing when we talk about exercise. I'm the weird person in the room because I like doing it. But yet the client base and the people we work with in health and fitness, they don't like doing exercise. And it's our challenge is to meet them where they need to be met, right? We need to make sure that I, as a personal trainer, someone who likes exercise, I recognise I'm the weird one in that space, right? That's not normal. Not for most people, they don't find 40 to 60 minutes of moderate to high intensity physical activity exciting, motivating, or something that gets them out of bed each morning. So I'm used to operating in that space. In terms of what we did, and where we were working with approximately 8,500 employees, around 10,000 towards the end of my tenure, and what we were doing in that compliance space. We were working across the UK and Europe, which, as you may or may not know, comes with its own challenges, as the legislation and the legalities differ as you move from each location. That presents its own challenges. And we were coming off of the back of 3 years of really significant growth, new investors who were pumping cash into the company. And we were growing really significantly, but we were also coming off of the back of a few health and safety incidents. And as Fraser already referenced, there's nothing like putting like an incident and a cost, to putting that back at the forefront of your mind and making sure that it becomes a really high priority. The challenge for us, though, was that we thought we were doing it really well. We had a learning management system in the business. And we had our compliance content, we had the breadth of it, and we thought we were doing a really good job in that space. And it wasn't until we went out to market to look at a replacement LMS, because it was old, it was antiquated, it wasn't engaging, it was PowerPoint slides that you had to click through and kill me, as you kind of mentioned at the start, right? It was exactly that piece. It wasn't engaging, it wasn't motivating, it wasn't innovative. It really operated in that space. And when we looked at what we had, we very quickly identified, and when we were building out our RFI and proposals, what we didn't recognise was we had a compliance need. But really quickly, as we started to get into that process and we'd selected our vendors and we'd begun to move forwards, we identified that we did have a compliance need. The old historical system wasn't tied to our HR system, so we knew who had done training, but we had no idea who hadn't done training. And so We were reliant on our teammates back in club to set people up and create them a user account, and this was really admin heavy, make sure that they were assigning them the right training, and we were assuming all of these good things were happening, and then it was being done and we were compliant because the reporting that came out of the system told us that we were 100% compliant, which it would do, because we didn't know who wasn't doing the training. Only people that were registered on the system were measured. And as we began through an implementation of our new platform, it very quickly came to light that we were not 100% compliant. We were around 12% compliant. So we were significantly way off the mark where we thought we would be. And in terms of that implementation, what we didn't recognize was that there was going to be a need to drive compliance as we inputted this system. What we were really focused on and what we were scoping out as we were on that journey was getting a great learning management system that was engaging, had user-generated content, would involve all of our teammates, and was a bells and whistles piece to drive our learning culture. And what blindsided us was, okay, now we've got to look at compliance again. Right? We thought we were in the sexy space, and then we got pulled back into that compliance space, and what we really needed to do was to re-look at and put our lenses back on to drive that compliance piece. So as we kind of moved into that phase, it was really important for us to implement strongly and successfully. And one of the things that really enabled that to be significantly possible was our communications plan. Really driving the awareness that this was coming long before it happened. It wasn't a big bang, here you go, it's landed. We drove awareness that this was a project that was happening. We had our teammates and our wider business involved in the procurement of the system. We did 2 final providers who we brought forwards, and we made that a optional attendance for all employees. They could come along, see those 2 final vendors, and they could vote on who the right provider they felt was for the business. And that really helped raise awareness that this was coming down the pipeline, but also buy-in and investment that they were involved in that decision and that they were engaged, their opinion was asked, and it mattered. We also run a competition to allow them to have their input into naming the platform. That was something that was really important to us, and we landed on the name Learning Locker, which was really appropriate because we were a health and fitness company. We had lockers in every one of our clubs. And so we did some reward and recognition around there, and lots of that comms was born out of troubles that we faced in that implementation phase, things that flagged up for us that were problems we had to solve for, but how could we drive awareness of that platform? A good example of that was we're a multi-site operator, so you're talking across 110 sites in the UK and about 30 across Europe. And yes, they have a back office. Most of the team members are out on the floor and engaging with our members. And that back office housed administrators and some heads of departments, and that's where their working typically took place. But that was also going to be the location that learning had to take place for all of our teammates across the business, so really kind of small spaces. And one of the things that came to light was that we were moving away from a provider that was click-through PowerPoint, and we were moving towards a provider that had bells and whistles, and we had content that was audio-based. It had engagement and games in there. And what comes with that audio is sound. And we were in small offices, and what we didn't know was that none of our terminals had any speakers. They were not programmed to do audio. It wasn't something that we had functionality for. And even if we did, we wouldn't want everybody doing that learning in that one office, blaring out through the speakers and distracting everybody else, because the rooms were a fraction of the size we're in now. So one of the ways that we creatively solved that problem was we drop-shipped some branded headphones that contain that Learning Locker logo out to all of the sites, and that enabled, with the sound cards, we could plug directly into that, and they could listen to that audio on that computer, but of course that improved the experience in other ways as well, as there's other uses for those pieces. But all of those things really helped drive awareness that this was coming, and that this platform was coming down the pipeline. We also did some pieces around, driving the engagement through an internal communication app. So after we drop shipped those headphones, what we got everybody to do was to post a picture of them wearing those headphones and doing their learning at their desks. And the best or silliest picture, we sent out some like a couple £100 in vouchers for their team to go out and do something as that club. And those things all really helped drive the uptake and the participation in that system. And the comms was really, really essential in how we managed to land and move that piece forwards. The other piece that really helped from a compliance perspective was piloting this program. So after we had imported all of this data across, and we now knew what the true picture of compliance was, and we were staring down the barrel of that 12.5%. As you can imagine, one of the key drivers of compliance training is risk mitigation, right? So we realized we were significantly exposed. And so there was a real diktat coming from above and a drive for us to help improve that problem. So what we looked at in terms of a pilot of the platform, we brought our top performing club from a client's perspective. We looked at our worst performing club from a compliance perspective and a middle of the range club in order to pilot the system and see if we could take any learnings from that before we went live across all 110 sites at one go. And some of the things that came out of that session which were really useful, we tested that for a 3-month period with those pilot clubs just to understand where the pain points were and what worked, what didn't work, and so we could overcome those teething problems when we went live. Is the learning for us was there was no difference whatsoever between those clubs and their compliance rates. So it was just happy accident that some of them were top performing, bottom performing, and middle of the range, because as soon as we put that lens on them and said, you 3 clubs have been selected to be part of a pilot group of this platform, we want to see how this affects things and how it changes, immediately all 3 of those clubs were 100% compliant within a 30-day period. So it wasn't a capability issue, it wasn't a will issue or a skill issue, it was we weren't putting them under the magnifying glass. So one of the really obvious things that came out and flagged up for us as part of that pilot program is we need to make compliance reporting, at least for now, one of the most visible metrics in the business. We need to put it right under the magnifying scope. We need to make it easily reportable. We need to make it really visual. And being a health and fitness organisation, they love a league table. Right? They're innately competitive. Put them on a league table. You can have promotion and relegation zones. Works wonders. And so that was a real kind of key measure for us, was to make this reporting really easily accessible and visible. So this is a dashboard that we produced that was shared out every week amongst our senior teams, and drove that from the top down. And within our first 90-day period, we had moved from that 12.5% up to a 97% compliance score over just the 90-day period with an organisation of close to 10,000 teammates. So it was a really significant step change. And the one thing that we did that I would account the most success to is put the lens over it. We made this a constant method of communication. It was incredibly visible. The bottom 10 clubs were in red. Nobody wanted to be in the relegation zone. You wouldn't believe the amount of impact that had. And what we saw as we moved to that 97% was increase in engagement, because one of the things that we were really conscious of as we started to go into this procurement phase was that we had lots, and you can imagine under a health and fitness operator such as we had kids classes, we have group exercise classes, we had swimming, we had tennis, we had food and beverage areas, we had indoor and outdoor pools. So there's a variety of different things happening under one roof, all of which carry health and safety concerns. F&B offering a big one. So all of these things sitting under that one roof was really important to us that we refined and condensed that and looked for the overlap, make sure that we weren't drowning people in repetition and repetition. So we managed to keep the same amount of courses, but we condensed the learning time down by half. So there was a significant reduction and a real key win in there for the teammates, because the nature of that compliance is you have to do it every year. And one of the big challenges when you're going through that implementation is do we preserve the learning records and the history of our team, or do we say everybody's got to do it again? And when it's as bad as 12.5%, the easiest call for us would have been to say, let's just make everybody start again. But given that 12.5% was only compliant, you would not believe the amount of noise that group would make around having to do it again. From a PR and internal PR perspective, It was a really valuable exercise to keep everybody happy and in a positive frame around that platform to bring over and transfer. It was a very long, laborious task. It wasn't easy to do, but it was certainly valuable in framing up L&D in a positive light, compliance in a positive light, and keeping the platform really, really positive and framed up in a good sense for them. Some of the other stats, in that 90-day period, we moved from 164,000 course completions, and we moved that forwards from about 5,000 is where we started at. That was our starting point. So huge amount of manpower and time investment from an organisational point of view. That is a lot of hours that we were paying out to our team. It was a really significant investment for us, but it was a really important one, and it paled in comparison to some of the fines that we potentially would have faced had there been an incident, and then had we had visibility of how poor that compliance rate was. The key stat there that I was really proud of, and it sits outside of that compliance space, but is optional course completions, and that was one of the key metrics that we really tracked, and that was a self-directed learning, self-enrollment. Because the space in which we were originally going to market for our learning experience platform, or LMS at the time, was that we were going for an enhancement, right? It was on all bells and whistles. But we got distracted by that compliance piece, and it very quickly led to the top of our agenda. And actually, as we moved into that optional course enrollments, that was something I was really conscious we didn't want to take our eye off from. And that's something that's made that learning management system live and breathe far beyond that compliance piece. And I'm wholeheartedly of the belief as that compliance rate has continued and still does continue after I've left to stay at that 97% mark. And when you account for onboarding, leavers, new starters, etc., that's about as close as 100% as we were ever going to get. It's remained in that space, and the longevity piece is around that self-directed learning, those things that people want to do for their own development. You don't have to do this, but we have an attractive enough offering that you want to come back and do and further yourself and move your career forwards. Those things keep people coming back to the platform, and whilst they're there, they do their compliance training. They get nudged into doing it. The platform stays at the forefront of their mind, and that really helps that annual requirement to get back in and revisit, live and breathe, and the platform to also be considered to have value, because our previous platform was compliance only. That was the only thing you went there for. And so there's not really anything to write home about, right? You can't be positively excited if that's all it does about getting there. But having weaved that piece in now, the platform is really well regarded. The biggest thing that our team members reach out to us for from a help desk or a support point of view in terms of the Learning Locker email address gets bombarded with is, I haven't got my certificate yet. It's not a system problem. They just take a day to process. But people are so keen to have that recognition, to log that on their history as it's showing as a course that they've done. They are constantly chasing and following up. And that's an email problem I'd like to have, because it really shows how well our team are engaged with that platform and how well engaged they are with what they receive from that. So to talk a little bit more about the results, we went through a really fast implementation process once we got going. So it's a bit like when you're building a house. Before I was a personal trainer, I was in construction, so my metaphors are kind of restricted to what I know, but you spend most of the time below ground, right? You drive past those building sites all of the time, nothing's happening, nothing's happening, nothing's happening, and the next time you go, the house is up. And that's because all of the foundational work and the stuff in the factories, now we're building timber frame houses, they build all the panels, turn up, ship them in one day, stand them up, shoot them in, and that's done. And that was really the same thing we did. We were able to go that fast because we had done the pilots, we had done the learnings, we had spent the time with the team in order to understand where the pain points would be. Inside that first 3 months, we had 90% of our team members who were logged into that platform. We had 100%, we were on track to reach 100% compliance, as I mentioned. 97 was about as close as we ever got to that piece, and once we factored in onboarding new starters, etc., that was about right. And in 2 months, the completions doubled from those achieved in the prior 15 years. So we had around 55,000 to 104,000 worth from a 15 years of course, which is what moved us out from that 12.5% space. So really, really positive results coming out the back of that implementation. And then where I'll leave you is around driving that cultural change. And these are the key 3 things that we did that really helped drive that uptake in that compliance. And we created the culture where people wanted to learn and could fit learning into their timetable. And that was the key thing, is we couldn't just flog the compliance horse. We had to give them a reason to come back to the system. And one of the things that worked incredibly well for our launch go live is having a piece of hero content or flagship content that gives people a reason to visit the system as you go live. What's the one thing that's going to be really impactful and give people a reason to go to your system as you go live and implement? We made compliance training without shadow of a doubt, even over and it was hard to do so, but we made compliance training more visible than the sales statistics and membership sales, right? And in a health and fitness organisation, that's hard to do. But we made that the most visible statistic, and the clubs felt absolute sense of responsibility and ownership, and that is how we drove that piece. And it was this created the culture of high performance and that league table which really drove that piece. And as much as driving people through the positive and being at the top of the leaderboard was a motivator, not being in the bottom or the red section, as it commonly became known, which was really not a conscious or a deliberate design by our reporting team, but it absolutely had a massive impact. But really a happy accident in that sense to help support and move people up that table and get them out of that red zone. So they ultimately took responsibility for their own learning, development, and their compliance rates in club. And that's where I want to leave you.
Okay, so it's the time for lots of questions, and just turn that off, there we go. We will just stand up here and do this. So we've got a roving mic. Anyone who's got a question, do raise your hand. We've got some at the front. I'm going to do a Don Taylor and say it's my gig, so I'm going to go first. I'm curious. I mean, I was taking notes there, and I hope that you've got lots of takeaways. There's never a usefulness in a case study unless actually we can apply it to our context. So I just want to say thank you to both of you, because there was a lot of contextual application to your stories, but we can all take something away. And I just want to come to you first, Josh. You asked or described a story linked directly to your context. So I want to, on behalf of everyone, really ask you, how did you get that wider buy-in? You're saying there about, it became more popular to look at the figures and not the sales figures. How the hell did you do that?
Well, it cost us a lot of money if we didn't. And I think Fraser alluded to that really early on. And I think what we had, and not to say that we had the luxury of, but we had incidents in our clubs. And unfortunately, in health and fitness leisure clubs, heart attacks, people having incidents in the pools, people getting their hair caught in treadmills, somewhat commonplace. And so those things happen in a somewhat frequent basis in those sites. And so it's really important to make sure that it becomes that number one priority. And so when we have those type of incidents, we were really communicative around that piece, and to make sure that that was really visible, but also to make people take a sense of ownership for that.
Okay. So people really were relating what you were teaching to their everyday world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the biggest piece is we didn't try to shy away from the reality of where we were at. So as we went live, we were open and honest about this is where we thought we were, and as a business, we thought we were, and this is where we actually are. And I think that was a real rocket for everybody to go, okay, that does sound bad. Yeah. 12.5%, that sounds pretty bad.
I could feel that in the room, couldn't you? When he said 12.5%, I was like, oh. Okay, what question over here?
Can I build on that? Because I think that what's really interesting is that there's a really stark compliance need around health and safety in a fitness setting. And every organisation has those hotspots. And if you're EasyJet, it's about health and safety, keeping your plane in the sky. Because frankly, if you don't focus on that, no one's ever going to get on board and you'll go bust. If you're Barclays Bank, it's around fraud and bribery, because otherwise no one's going to give you their money to look after. So maybe there's something around really knowing that hotspot and leveraging that. I mean, for us at Welcome, much less about health and safety, but we've got some hotspots around safeguarding in relation to a public venue, and we've got hotspots around data in relation to processing vast amounts of personal data. And I think it's perhaps knowing where those hotspots are and then leveraging them to drag the rest with it.
know your hotspots, because that's your context. Okay, thank you. The question we had, gentleman over here, who's going to, we've got, sorry, she's chosen over here. Go over here.
Yeah.
Who's running this show?
So I have a question for Josh, actually. With a magnifying glass, what I would be worried is that I'm building a culture of associates that's going to complete the training, that's going to do the training just to do it, because it's under the magnifying glass, everyone sees it, but a culture where the knowledge is not managed throughout the timeline. So were you in the organization checking up on and following up on the knowledge that's being retained within the organization between the periods when they're doing the compliance trainings?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think the key thing to identify there was when there is that amount of direct pressure on an area, you get compliance for compliance sake, right? And that was something that we were really conscious of, and we worked with our team on the ground to be able to drive, because what we needed to do was temperature check in the clubs whether or not where that compliance shifted. Okay, great, now let's go and do some visits on those sites to see if anything has changed. So we would have a health and safety audit which goes hand in hand. And that was one of our real key measures to kind of temperature check. Is this working? Is it driving more compliance, or is it driving the tick box process and now we look more compliant, but do the results change at all? And that was something we did really heavily in the pilot groups. So we would look at where the uptick of their learning, then we would go in and do some health and safety visits, and we could compare that to where they were pre and post. And we did see the direct correlation there. One of those pilot clubs, we saw no correlation whatsoever, and what it turned out had been happening during that pilot club is the administrator had realised what everybody's welcome password was, because it was all the same, and had done everybody in their club. And we picked that up through that temperature check. We went, hold on, well, this club hasn't moved forwards after their order. Their compliance has shot up, but we've gone and done that health and safety temperature check, and we're not seeing a step change. And so that prompted us to dig a little bit deeper, and that also prompted a real change in how we went live to the whole company. We didn't use the same welcome password for everybody.
A good reminder that yeah, it's not just the tick box, it's beyond that. Okay.
Hey, amazing talks, thank you. So my question was more for Fraser, and it was around the way that you took the sort of more operational guidance and as such sort of dumbed it down and made it a little bit more digestible. And coming from an organisation where a lot of our training is based on operational guidance and everything's very based on legislation and very technical terms, how did you approach taking that to sort of higher management and people who would be more adverse to not changing it from the legal terms and actually incorporating Section 54, Part A and Part B, and actually sort of get the buy-in from those sides of the company to being able to make it more digestible?
Yeah, great question. And I think we're quite lucky in that at a senior level, they probably were the strongest voices to say, take that away from the tedium of legalness. So you know, we're an organisation of sort of free thinkers, and we're quite allergic to that sort of legalistic approach. So it was actually for us quite easy. I think what's really important though, and we did a lot of this, is user, for want of a better term, but colleague testing, talking to people about things and understanding what language does resonate, because a lot of that technical jargon is just jargon, and actually you can really unpick it into everyday concepts. And I think the things that stood out were around it was also how can you make it less dull. And the analogies, I think, was a really strong way of doing that. It was turning the conversation into something people can identify with, care about, as opposed to abstract. And that was where the win was, I think. You know, just make it easy for people. Yeah, if you focus on compliance, you could be 100% compliant, but if no one understands it or does it, it's a waste of time. You've got to get, you know, 100% of people 80% of the way there, and that's a win.
There's been stories on this stage before of exactly that, where you can have the legal side of things ramped up, all the boxes are ticked, but still actually morally, ethically be questionable as to whether you're actually doing the right thing. And you mentioned you'd worked with Actian, didn't you? And they've worked with other clients in a similar way because of exactly that, huge fines.
I mean,
I like the fact that you said don't wait to get to that sort of huge fine stage.
But I'd probably be hung, drawn and quartered by most of the legal profession. But I think, if something goes wrong and your defence is, well, there's a legal loophole, so we're compliant, you've probably lost the argument already. It's incumbent on an organisation that's trying to do the right thing to think harder than how do we just scrape over the bar. Compliance, I think about as the sort of the high jump. If you scrape over the bar and it wobbles, great, you got over the bar. But actually, if it's really important to who you are as an organisation, if it's important to your DNA, push the bar higher.
You heard it here first, people. Push the bar higher. We have a question at the front.
So thank you for both of your presentations really showed what everyone I think is very aware of, that compliance is no longer the regulatory legality tick box that has to be done, but there's also that culture and ethics shift. So I work in finance, and one of the things I find really difficult and would like to hear your opinion on is the responsibility of compliance training, because we're at a learning conference, but as compliance shifts from a tick box regulatory exercise to becoming culture, to becoming the not back office led, people on the field should be doing the compliance training and teaching others. HR want to be involved from a perspective, legal want to be involved, other risk areas want to be involved. And when does that become, now we're on this kind of journey of compliance, who owns that risk? Because it's becoming more and more difficult for me to really understand who should be sitting here listening to this from an organisation perspective, or from a, who holds that in an organisation.
Who were your stakeholders and how did you get them involved?
I'm happy to sort of lean into that one. We operate 3 lines of defence model. Internal audit, the third line, a relatively new risk compliance function, that's me. Second line, management, the first line. We're very, very keen to push responsibility on doing compliance. That is a first line function. Management need to own that. We catalyse that. So we create the frameworks, the training, the tools, such that the first line management can do the doing. Third line come along and assess whether they're doing it right. I sort of analogize with teaching. The first line are the students, the second line are the teachers, and the third line are the examiners. As the second line, we're providing the assignments, the tools to help the learning for management to do. And the examiners come in and tell you at the end of the year whether you've passed or not. But it's really important to get management owning it, because otherwise it becomes a thing that compliance is doing to the organisation, and that'll never be embedded.
It can be easy, can't it? Because the managers are close to the risk, potentially.
Absolutely.
The people that are close to the risk have got more interest.
And
as soon as they've got more interest, they will engage with it. The problem then you've got is the people that are line managed are so far from the risk, they don't care. So how do you make them that much more interested in the risk?
Completely right. And we've tackled that by having specific manager training, really zoomed in on what is it you actually need to do as a manager. What do you need to be thinking about? This is core to your role. We're reflecting that within annual performance objectives. Everybody has a risk and controls objective. That shines through in performance reviews at the end of the year. That element of hard wiring, again, all formal mechanisms, there's still that big informal piece. It's the storytelling, it's the rituals, it's role modelling, getting teams that have done it well, tell that story. Oh, okay, that's how finance have done it. That's how that organisation has done it. Learn, share, build. That has to be the way, and it's not going to be an overnight thing.
How about for you, Josh? Stakeholders?
Yeah, and I can talk about that from our perspective, and how you're structured as an organisation will largely dictate some of those things. But certainly from my perspective, we have a health and safety team and a risk director, who is a key stakeholder who we have to get really close to as part of that implementation process. But I think it's a really great question because that line gets blurred, right? Because it is training and it sits with us as L&D professionals because it's a training piece. But we are not accountable for that piece, or certainly I wasn't, because that sits with our health and safety team. But it's about really getting up and close with them. And the way that I saw my role, and I think it's how I see my role as an L&D business partner in all the organisations I've been in, is it's about providing systems, tools and processes to empower the business to be successful in the areas that they are. And so, we work with SMEs all the time, right? We can't be experts in absolutely everything. And health and safety is certainly not a field I'm an expert in and have no desire whatsoever to be an expert in. But it was the challenge for me, and where I did see I was accountable was to provide the systems, tools and process to empower it to happen.
Great. Any other questions? Got one at the back in the check shirt on your way. Do you want to just pick up that one there?
Yeah, I've worked in a couple of organisations in the pharma industry where compliance has been a problem, and we've got to the point where we've had issues, and I know your conversation there, Josh, was talking about massive growth, and I'm just wondering what your views are on compliance insofar as I think inherently people want to be compliant, they want to do the right thing, but sometimes when a healthcare gym company is chasing new customers, new members, they grow and they're successful, but they forget about the back office stuff. And I'm sure it's the same in the Wellcome Trust as well. And so my thoughts and my questions are around how do we make sure when we're in a growth phase that we keep the real good ethical base that we've got in a small company, and how do we make sure that ethics and compliance grows alongside the sales organisation?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's one that's, I think, particularly challenging. When we spoke about coming off the back of 3 years of consistent growth and significant investment and opening new and multiple sites, and for me it was really about two things. When we were in the clubs, almost every club has had an incident in their history. Some of them have been open really long times. Almost every club has had an incident of some shape or form. Unfortunately, due to the nature of the business, it's relatively commonplace to have some sort of incident. They're not always caused by the facilities. Lots of people just have incidents in those settings. And so when we are in clubs and we are delivering compliance or health and safety training and we're working with those specific teams, one of the really powerful things for us is to bring those incidents to life. Because lots of our teammates work really closely and build really strong relationships with our members. They've heard of the incident, they perhaps know the person who's involved, or they'll certainly know people who were. So that really helps to bring it to life and give a real sense of personal responsibility, because there's a strong emotional tie to a lot of these people, or the people that would have been on shift in dealing with those things. So that's something that works really effectively when we're in those clubs. The challenge when opening new sites and moving into those areas is that they are brand new and they don't have that piece. So it's really about linking to known concepts. And again, everybody in the room will be familiar with that as a learning technique, right? And most of the people coming in and looking at who are responsible for the opening of new sites are either moving from existing ones, moving from the same industry over. So we spend a lot of time sharing the incidents and experiences that they've had and gone over, because it really drives that personal responsibility. And what may be different for us as an employer is those incidents and where compliance really shows up, our frontline team members are close to that. They are the ones who are personally responsible, and the incidents are really close to them. So it often happens close to home, and there's a good motivation there. So this is likely to happen to somebody when you're in and around. And we have automatic defibrillators in all of our sites, and it's rare to meet somebody who hasn't had to use them or hasn't had occasion or been around somebody who has. So it really helps drive that personal accountability and responsibility. So we try and keep it as real as possible. Does that help answer somewhat?
Hi. Obviously, given by its nature, compliance training is really important because of the risk associated with non-compliance. Within your organisations, are there consequences, or do you hold people accountable if they do not complete their mandatory compliance education?
Do you want to take that one?
I'm happy to. Yeah, no. We need to, and we're starting to, but historically, actually, we haven't really done the level of training we should have done, and we certainly haven't been holding people accountable because it wasn't even there. So for us, this culture shift is starting from a pretty low base. I think it's important to do it. I think it's important to do it in the right way. So it's, I'm a great believer that you set standards, but then you support people in reaching those standards. And it's providing the fair opportunity for people to do that. And then, being with them to make sure they do it, rather than it being in any way sort of disciplinary. So I think that's something that we're striving for. As I said, now we've built it into our objective setting process, and that will form part of appraisal processes that people need to have done it. But no, it's not something that we have historically done.
Yeah, and to answer from my perspective, the answer is also no. So it is not something that there is disciplinary action or any recompense in terms of consequence. The worst thing that's going to happen is the notifications gear up.
Yeah.
So as you go overdue, you're getting pestered pretty daily, which is, some people become compliant out of sheer annoyance and irritation. It works pretty effectively, but no, there isn't a disciplinary or follow-up action.
I actually disagree with both of you, because what you've done is you've created a culture where it's not acceptable to not be compliant. And so that's why you had 97%, because you had the league table. That in itself is not consequence, as you're suggesting perhaps, but it is a motivator. And is it not more positive to play into the carrots, the motivators, than beat people with a stick of annoying emails?
This is it, behaviour change, mindset change. It's more than carrot, it's more than stick, it's and you don't need to do one. It's a myriad of things. Try what you can, see what works. If something doesn't work, don't do it.
It's a total reframe of thinking we need to be compliant to actually what behaviours do we want to see around risk.
Yeah.
Okay, there was another question I think at the back there.
Hello. I work in the nuclear sector, so very heavily regulated, lots of compliance training, and it is very much, if you're not compliant, you haven't completed that, you will not be deployed, so it's very black and white for us. Because it's a tick in the box exercise, you won't be deployable. It feels as though the ethics side is lost where I work. It's very much, let's do the minimum that we have to do to be able to tick and say that person's compliant. So I loved all the talk around be braver and try new approaches, and I understand the whole learning theory about that and the reward back from that. But how have you guys, if you've had it, dealt with that pushback of just do the minimum because it's a compliance and we have to do it, so let's get that out the way almost? Have you felt that sort of pushback when you've tried to be a bit more creative? And obviously for ourselves, it's taxpayers' money that I'm spending, so that brings a lot of scrutiny as well.
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. And it actually ties back to what you asked, and changed my answer to a degree. So food and beverage was an indicator, or was an example of a sector where actually it had to be completed on your first day, otherwise you can't enter into that back office, you can't fulfill your job, you can't do your roles. So I guess in that instance there's some degree of similarity, although I would say the risk's probably lower. But I think the challenge there is it becomes, and you gear it very too much towards that it's a task to do as opposed to it's a change to make. And I think that's the difference, and that's the change that you want to be looking for, is how do we operate, how do we do things differently? And for me it's about, when we spoke about it earlier, we're going back to sense check the train has taken a hold. Because if that's the way that you have a culture of treating it, in order to start to unpick that, you have to in my mind, you have to highlight the risk again. Because as we spoke about, it's risk mitigation. That risk is only mitigated if you understand the training and change what you're doing as a result of that piece. So for me, it's about jumping back in, assessing whether or not the training is taking a hold and having an effect, and highlighting where it isn't, to gain that senior manager and stakeholder buy-in. And I think the most efficient and effective way to do that is through risk and highlighting where you're exposed.
Okay. I'm afraid we've got no more time for questions, but I don't know about you, I've got a myriad of notes written down here, and I was going to précis them and do a lovely summary, but so many great ideas, I can almost not start. We'd have another 50-minute session. So thank you so much to our guests, Josh and Fraser, for just reminding us that compliance needs to be closer to the risk, a behaviour change, and certainly not just a tick box exercise. Thanks very much, everybody.